Today's topic is sectarianism. It's a common misconception that sectarianism is all about religious differences. Well, not so. Sectarianism is complex. It is anchored within a framework of human rights, tolerance, and social justice. Sectarian violence is rooted in prejudice, discrimination, or hatred. Such violence can occur whenever there are divisions within a society. Examples are ethnic identity, class, or region for citizens of a state, factions of a political movement, and of course, different denominations of a religion. Unfortunately, there are not many places in the world where sectarian strife and conflict do not exist. Our presenter today from Florida, USA, is Dr. Bashir Datoo. He will enlighten us on his research into this complex subject. Dr. Datoo has an impressive bio, which was shared in the notice of this meeting. But briefly, he has a Ph.D., has taught at universities in Tanzania and the US at Princeton, and he is an author of 4 books. Without further ado, Dr. Datoo, I'll hand it over to you to do your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazmullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You have the topic on the screen, evil of sectarianism. We'll look at its underpinnings as well as its politicization. This topic is from my most recent book that's entitled Islam, Misconceptions and Challenges. There are 2 parts to this book. The first part contains 10 essays that are on the most common misconceptions about Islam that non-Muslims have, and unfortunately some Muslims as well. And the second part contains 10 essays on pressing challenges that are faced by Muslims themselves. Now, our moderator, Nazmullah, had the honor to choose which one of the 10 essays in the second part on challenges he wanted us to present today, and he chose the topic on sectarianism. This is what we'll try to cover during the time at our disposal. We'll begin with the definition of sectarianism. Then we'll look at the admonitions of sectarianism in the Holy Book, the Quran. Then a brief note, introductory comments on prevalence of sectarianism over time. Then we'll look at 2 examples of intra-Muslim sectarianism in the Middle East, 2 more examples of interfaith group sectarianism beyond the Middle East, and then we'll try and analyze the forces behind sectarianism. And I've grouped them into 2 externally driven forces in politicization, and then internally driven forces. And now these have moved from politicization to weaponization. Then we'll briefly look at adverse effects of sectarianism and some ways of combating sectarianism. So let's begin with the definition of sectarianism. Sometimes the word is used broadly to define any kind of differences among subgroups within a country or even a region. So the differences can be religious sects, ethnic identities, social classes, geographic regions, or political factions. Typically, however, it's narrowly defined to focus on differences between religious sects or denominations, and or majority minority faith groups within a country. So there are two types of sectarianism: inter-religious sectarianism and intra-faith groups, interfaith group sectarianism. Now we look at a few Quranic admonitions, Quranic warnings, and disapproval of admonitions. There are two sets of admonitions. There is first a general statement. This is designed to impress Muslims of the importance of remaining united. And the ayat reads, "And hold fast to the rope of Allah and do not be divided." But then there is a very specific admonition in the Quran that warns Muslims against being divided into sects. The ayat reads, "Surely this Islam is your religion and one religion." And they, meaning later generations, broke their religion into sects among themselves. To us shall all come, they shall all come back. And Quran in a number of different places says that he will be the ultimate judge. He will decide what to do with those who divided themselves. Then there are a couple more admonitions in the Quran. There is a very strong disapproval, and this relates to intra-religious sectarianism, intra-faith sectarianism. Allah strongly disapproves of sectarian division. It says, the Quran says, "Surely they who have divided the religion into parts and became sects, you have no concern with them. Their affair is only with Allah. Then He will inform them of what they did, and He will judge them for what they did." But then there is a general exaltation for interfaith groups, sectarianism. Allah extends honor and esteem to all of His creations. And the ayat says, "And we have indeed honored," karamna, which is honored. "We have indeed honored the children of Adam, provided them with good things," meaning sustenance and growth, "and preferred them in esteem." Fadallana, preferred them in esteem, honor, over most of those who we have created. So that human beings are honored by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He considers them to be His best creation, and He honors them above animals and above jinn, even above jinn. So those are His other creations, but human beings are honored above all of them. Just some comments on the prevalence of sectarianism over time. Sectarianism is as old as history itself. It has occurred, the occurrence is widespread throughout the world, different regions of the world, from time immemorial, from antiquity to current time. Historically, though, some sects and some faith groups have coexisted harmoniously for centuries. They have lived in close proximity to each other in the same neighborhoods, and sometimes have even intermarried among themselves. But within the past few decades, both intra and intersectarianism has become really pronounced. Within the Middle East, intrasectarianism is pervasive. It exists from Lebanon in the west to Iraq in the east, and from Syria in the north to Saudi Arabia in the south. So it's really widespread in the Middle East. Beyond the Middle East, there is also sectarianism. This is interfaith group sectarianism that exists in diverse regions of Asia and even Europe. So we'll begin with the first example of intra-Muslim sectarianism in the Middle East. And my first example is from Saudi Arabia. It dates back to the early part of the 20th century when the kingdom of Saudi Arabia was first established. Shia activists from the eastern province, which happens to be the oil-rich province of Saudi Arabia, which is why the monarchy is so concerned about the activism in the eastern province, they protested to demand political reform. They were harassed, imprisoned, subject to extra-legal pressures. But early on, they were released whenever the monarchy felt it was prudent to do so and reconcile with them. But then things began to happen. First, the Iraq invasion and occupation in 2002. It unleashed Sunni-Shia tensions. And when it was followed by the Arab Spring of 2011, we saw massive, large-scale popular protests throughout the Middle East. The Saudi regime was alarmed to see these large-scale, massive protests, so it went back on its attempts to reconcile, at reconciliation. It doubled down on its commitment to sectarianism. The second example is Bahrain. This is the only Gulf state, as you probably know, with Shia majority, but that's ruled by a Sunni minority, a Sunni monarchy. Saudi Arabia promoted sectarianism in Bahrain to promote its own internal stability and hegemony in the Arabian Peninsula. So Shias in the eastern province were discriminated at work. They did not have easy access to the workforce. They were discriminated in education and in the provision of social services. And then, worst of all, the monarchy decided to grant citizenships to Sunnis from other Muslim countries in order to alter the demographic composition of Bahrain, reduce the majority component of Shias in Bahrain. So previously, there were calls for reform and participation in the political process that involved non-violent activism, and most importantly, cross-sectarian cooperation. It wasn't, this activism was not just conducted by Shias, but other the Sunnis of Bahrain who wanted to see changes in the political process. Then the Arab Spring happened, and it was brutally put down, crushed by the Saudi-led GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. But the regime, the Bahraini regime, claimed that these protests were all orchestrated by Iran, which of course had the effect of destroying all cross-sectarian cooperation. So now the activism was restricted to just the Shias and they became the target of full-fledged sectarianism. Now let's turn to two more examples of interfaith groups sectarianism beyond the Middle East. A very classic example is Myanmar, which formerly was called Burma. This is the tension between Rohingya Muslims and the Buddhist majority. Some scholars maintain that Rohingyas are indigenous to the country, but others claim that no, they are illegal immigrants who arrived from Bangladesh during the British colonial era. So the government there has denied citizenship to the Rohingyas, and they are therefore stateless. They are refused basic human rights that include education, employment, healthcare, even freedom of movement. They have also confiscated arable land of Rohingyas and given them to Buddhists from other parts of the country. And then they subjected the Rohingyas to forced labor. They're forcing them to work on those arable lands that they initially themselves owned. This, of course, led to increased migration in non-seaworthy boats to neighboring countries. Another example is from Africa, Nigeria. Muslims in the northern part of Nigeria and Christians in the southern part of Nigeria. Now, the north was a center of pre-colonial Muslim empire. So the population in the north looks to the wider Muslim world, to the Middle East and the wider Muslim world for socio-political inspiration. Whereas the South looks to the West, and also they draw on African tradition for their socio-political influences. With religion and ethnicity being preeminent markers of our identity in Nigeria, it led to conflicts over land, over resources, and even over political clout. Should have mentioned that in the north, we have Muslims who are primarily from the Hausa Fulani tribes, whereas in the south is much more diverse, but the two prominent tribes in the south are the Yoruba and the Igbo. The tension within Nigeria intensified with the emergence of Boko Haram. Boko Haram is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, an extremist Muslim organization. And it was compounded by the fact that they declared their policy to be implementing the Sharia law in the areas that they control, which was the northeastern part of Nigeria, over which they gained control at the beginning of the 21st century. And the Nigerians claim that they are hard-pressed to distinguish between the politically driven Islamic movement, which is the movement of Boko Haram, from the faith-driven Islam, which is in fact the faith of the majority of Muslims, even in northern Nigeria. Let's now try and analyze, first of all, externally driven forces in the politicization of sectarianism. The colonial powers, especially Great Britain, used a strategy that is referred to as divide and rule, or divide and conquer. They inflamed differences that pre-existed before their arrival, but were not as pronounced. But with the introduction of the strategy of divide and rule, or divide and group, the goal was to play off one group against another. And the goal was to prevent these groups from forming alliances to challenge their own rule, to challenge their colonial subjugation. In Nigeria, the strategy was applied in the form of indirect rule, which was to govern through traditional rulers and through the traditional institutions. In the north, this was facilitated by the pre-colonial political structure. So the British relied on this structure to try to play off one group versus another group. In the south, there was no such hierarchical structure. So they looked for designated malleable persons who could act as chiefs. And because they were set up to act as chiefs, they did not really command the respect of the bulk of the population. Situation was worsened, as we saw, with the emergence of Boko Haram at the beginning of the 20th century. especially when they declared that their goal was the implementation of Sharia law. Christians in the south feared persecution from Boko Haram. They also feared that their freedoms, which were guaranteed in the Nigerian constitution, they feared that their freedoms will be curtailed, which consequently heightened the tensions between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria. Now, in Bahrain, even though it wasn't colonized by the British, they decided to continue with the strategy of divide and rule, even in the post-colonial period. The monarchy perceived threats from the internal population. So in order to prevent opposition fractions from uniting cross-sectionally against unpopular policies of the government, they decided to implement this strategy of divide and rule. And Bahrain's parent state, which is Saudi Arabia, contributed to this widening gap between the Sunnis and the Shias in Bahrain. And they did this by by putting a wedge between the so-called Islamists and liberals in Bahrain itself. So what happened was that these two groups, the so-called Islamists and liberals within Bahrain across sectarian lines, these two groups began to attack each other instead of working together as they did before, working together to forge a common political agenda and to fight against unpopular government policies. Now, in addition to externally driven forces, we also have internally driven forces. And now, instead of politicization, this has exacerbated into weaponization. So politicization became actually weaponized now. Sectarianism is sometimes infused with politics, and this is how it becomes weaponized. And it's manifested in the foreign policy of countries that seek to manipulate it. Now, in the examples that we are looking at, there were key, what I call bookend developments that escalated sectarian tensions in the Middle East. These are bookend developments because they began with a certain development and then they reached its peak culmination in some other development. The first of these development, one end of the bookend was the Islamic Revolution that occurred in 1979. Saudi really feared the spread of revolutionary Islam from Iran. They saw that Iran swept away the Pahlavi regime, and therefore they were extremely concerned, nervous that they too could be toppled, their regime could be toppled from power if this revolutionary fervor were to spread beyond Iran itself. And the second bookend development was the Iran nuclear deal of 2015. Saudi Arabia now was alarmed by the rising stock of Iranian international community. This deal Iran struck with P+5, the 5 UN permanent security members, +1 refers to Germany. So they saw that their stock, the Iranian stock, had risen in the eyes of the worldwide community, especially the US and the European Union. So they were alarmed by it. But these two developments, the bookend, as I call them, occurred in 1979 and 2015. there was a gap of 35 or more years between these two. So how did Saudi Arabia fare during this time? Unfortunately, there were certain intervening events which helped to increase the tensions between Shias and Sunnis in the Middle East. There was, first of all, soon after the Islamic Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War. Then there was the expulsion of Israel from southern Lebanon by Hezbollah, occurred in 2000. Then there was the US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq, which occurred in 2003. Then there was the widespread explosion of Arab Spring in 2011. Then there was insurgency in Syria, which began in 2011. And then the Houthis in Yemen captured Sana'a, the capital, which was followed by Saudi GCC Gulf Cooperation Council campaign against Yemen in 2014. So all these intervening events exacerbated religious tensions within the Middle East. There are also other forces at play in the Middle East. The foreign policy in the Middle East is advanced through proxy wars. These are proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they are fueled by what are called two fault lines. The first of these fault lines is the Sunni Shia fault line, specifically the Wahhabi Salafi from Saudi Arabia and the 12 Shias from Iran. Then there is also the second fault line, the Arab-Persian fault line. This is an ethnic fault line between the Arabs of the Middle East and the Persians of Iran. Now, why did Saudi Arabia choose to capitalize, manipulate these tensions? Because it served two purposes for them. One, it helped to blunt Iran's appeal to the Sunni population following the Iranian Revolution. The Sunnis were excited throughout the Middle East. That's why we had the explosion of the Arab Spring. So Saudi Arabia wished to blunt Iran's appeal to Sunni population who could unite to demand reforms that they were not giving it to them. But also it acted as currency in intra-Sunni competition. There was intra-Sunni competition for regional influence. And there were two aspiring rivals, Turkey and to a lesser extent, Qatar, which is a lot smaller, of course, than Turkey. So for those two reasons, Saudi Arabia decided to inflame these political religious tensions. So having gone through some of these examples of intra and inter sectarianism, let's briefly just touch on the adverse effects of sectarianism. There is an astute commentator who opined that labels do not create sex. What creates sex is sectarian behavior. It's not the labels, it's the behavior that creates sectarianism. And then once this is set off, there is a chain reaction. He goes on to say that sectarianism causes division, then division causes hate, then hate causes extremism, then extremism causes bloodshed. And he concludes that this is then a perfect recipe for an unstable society. This is why sectarianism is an evil, as I call it in my title of the presentation. It's a scourge, as our moderator prefers to call it, Nasmul. And it's the reason why it's so severely admonished in the Quran. So how do we combat this sectarianism? And I'm going to look briefly at the regional level and also then at the transnational level. One way is to have declarations among Islamic sects, denominations, in order to contribute to social harmony and address common challenges. One very good example is from the southern part of California, where I forget, trying to look for the name. Don't have it here. It's among the different sects, religious sects in Southern California. And they develop an honor code, as I think they call it, an honor code, a code of honor, way back in 2004. And here are three of the key clauses among several in this code of honor. One was non-tolerance of takfir, which is the charge of unbelief that Wahhabis level against other fellow Muslims, and therefore they can be killed because of this belief in takfir. Then they have another clause which calls for respect for personalities, places, and events that are held in esteem by the different sects. So they demand that we should respect the personalities, places, and events that are honored by different sects. And then they disallow condescending speech and literature among themselves, not just speech, but also dissemination of literature among themselves. So that's one way where in Southern California, they've tried to mitigate, combat as best as they can with this proclamation of Code of Honor. And then another one, which is now fairly prevalent, is the intra-faith dialogue. And the purpose of this dialogue is emphasized is to learn, not to proselytize. The purpose is to gain understanding and acceptance of differences of opinion among the different sects and denominations. The goal of these interfaith dialogues is not to eliminate the differences, to recognize and understand the differences. So it's to learn and not to proselytize, and it's to understand and accept, not eliminate the differences. And the method of dialogue that is now recommended is called religio-logical analysis. This is the official definition of religio-logical analysis. It's a systematic, coherent, and relatively objective method of understanding and analyzing worldviews of partner sects denominations. And this approach, this methodology consists of a set of questions that highlight beliefs among these different sects and denominations rather than focus on their actions. Now, at the transnational level, it's not as easy or relatively easy as it is at the regional level. It's far more difficult to de-escalate geopolitical sectarianism that's infused with politics, as we saw, than it has been then to de-escalate it. The geopolitical sectarianism passion were inflamed to such an extent now that it's now a lot more difficult to de-escalate these tensions. It began with King Abdullah of Jordan. In 2004, he raised the specter of a Shia crescent. He linked Beirut to Tehran, and he linked Syria to Iraq through their capitals. So he said there was a link between Tehran and, between Beirut and Tehran, and it ran through Damascus and Baghdad. So all across the Middle Eastern region. And this Shia solidarity, as he called it, a new brand of Shia solidarity, it was for regional dominance. So he excited the fears of other Arabs in the Middle East. But there have been recent developments. One is the US pivot to East Asia. So the Arab states now worry that the US European material and moral support that they have enjoyed for so long now might erode, given that US has pivoted towards East Asia. That's one concern. The other concern they have is that Israel does not seem to have impressed upon the US to go to war to Iraq. So this concerns them as well. So what have they decided to do? They've decided to sign on to Israel's new policy, which is dubbed the diplomacy of encirclement of Iran. So what they're trying to do is encircle Iran in all different directions, not just with Arab countries that they can manipulate, but also with non-Arab countries like Azerbaijan. And this has resulted, as we have seen in the press, in trade exchanges among all these different countries and among tourist exchanges, even with Saudi Arabia. It's already occurring in the Emirates. So given these developments, the US pivot to East Asia and US reluctance, at least seeming reluctance, to go to war with Iran, Saudi has simultaneously begun conciliatory talks with Iran. Previously, the intermediary was Oman, but Oman is a relatively small country. So now the intermediates, they're doing this through the intermediacy of Iraq. But it's too early to say what will come out of this initiative. The outcome is still very uncertain. So in the meantime, we can expect that intra-faith groups and interfaith sectarianism will continue in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Excellent. That was great. Lots to discuss. And as we said in the introduction, it's a complex subject. And you obviously done a fair bit of research, and you've given us some examples to sort of highlight the position and the points. There is one question I see in the chat, and anyone else who has questions, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat, please. And this is from Raza Kara. How do you see global sectarianism within our community? By community, I guess, Raza, by probably means that you're thinking of the local community in Toronto, you're thinking of the Shia community generally, or Muslim community. Anyway, let me finish the question first. You have not mentioned sectarianism prevalent in the Asian subcontinent, especially India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other surrounding countries. I think, Bashir, before you answer that, I would just say that we have an international audience. We have sort of participants of various denominations, and we are all aware of sort of what is happening. And having said that, I think Bashir Bhai also mentioned in the introduction that his research was based, the book itself is on Islam and and I forget the exact title, but you have studied it from mainly, if I understood it right, from an Islamic perspective. But in any case, Bashir Bhai, do you want to answer this question?
Sure. Well, there are examples, as the brother has pointed out, in Asia, as well as in other parts of the world. But I just focused on two examples of intra-religious sectarianism, as interfaith group sectarianism, in the interest of time. But yes, there is sectarianism in other parts of Asia as well. And it's also in Europe too. Remember, until recently, we had sectarianism in Ireland, Northern Ireland. We had sectarianism in the former Czechoslovakia Republic, which was really pretty severe. So sectarianism is paramount, as I said, everywhere. And it still exists in our current century. But coming to sectarianism within the community, fortunately, it's not severe. In part because of the interfaith dialogue that a lot of the centers in at least the US and Canada have embarked upon. So this minimizes any misunderstanding, any disrespect among the different religions. So that's one way in which we have been able to minimize, not obliterate, but minimize sectarianism within our communities in the US and Canada in particular. I don't know to what extent this interfaith dialogue occurs in Europe. I'm sure it occurs in England, but I don't know about the continent of Europe. But what is lacking is that when we have thrown open our centers to people not only of different sects or denominations within the Muslim fraternity, but we have also thrown it open to non-Muslims. But the sad part is that we don't do much more than just throw it open. We don't, for instance, welcome people who come to our centers for the first time. We don't have designated people who approach these new faces and welcome them. And where possible, we don't integrate them fully within our community, especially if they are from some Muslim denominations. We don't get them involved in some of our committees in which they may be able to make a contribution. So there is a lot more work to be done, but as best as I see from my perspective, we don't see that much sectarianism within our local communities.
Fair point. Yeah. Next question is from Mohammed Maulidina. He likes the presentation. Question, what are some examples of interfaith sectarianism between Muslims and other faiths in the Middle East and beyond, where the overriding force is more than, or probably something other than religion?
That's a very good question. We are focused on religious differences. In the couple of examples that we talked about interfaith groups, sectarianism, we hinted that there are other factors at play, but religion is still the primary, the dominant factor that drives sectarianism. In Nigeria, for instance, we saw the influence of ethnicity in Nigeria, but it plays a minor role compared to religion. We saw in the case of Rohingya, that is, it's a pretext that they have brought up about the fact that these Rohingyas are not indigenous to the country, they are migrants from Bangladesh, and they came more recently during the British colonial period. So they're using that as an excuse to inflame religious tensions there. But the paramount force there, even given this overlay of nationality, the paramount force is the religious differences between Muslims and Buddhists. So if you're looking for examples where, particularly in the Middle East, first of all, and then we'll look at beyond the Middle East, if we are looking for an example, and I'll just cite one, in the Middle East, where religion does play a role, but it's overlaid by certain other considerations. So let's look at the example of Israel, for instance. There it's overlaid by the Israeli or the Zionist policy of territorial expansion and exclusivity. They are expanding their settlements, illegal, as most of the world says, but doesn't do anything about it. They're expanding their settlements in the West Bank. They are practicing apartheid with Muslims who live within the borders of Israel. But their policy is to expand territorially and to make it exclusive to Israelites. So there is this factor which overrides religious differences. That's a more powerful factor than, I think, religious differences. There is always religious differences between the Israelites and the Palestinians, but it's overlaid by this policy of Zionism that seeks to expand its territories and deny human rights to the Palestinians who live within their borders. The example beyond the Middle East, there are several, but I'll pick on the Chinese example. As we know, there are these Muslims, Uyghurs, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in the western provinces of China that are allegedly discriminated by the Chinese government. But it's not so much based on religious differences as it is based on what I call state ideology. The Chinese play down religion. They don't want religious differences to escalate. So their state ideology requires that everybody conforms to it, presumably conform to communism. So there we have, religion is there, but it's overridden by the state ideology. So I would cite those two examples of Israel and China to answer that. A very good question from Brother Mouladin.
There's also the Rwanda example.
Yes. Yes, there are examples all over. Like we said, sectarianism is widespread. It covers almost all regions of the world, all continents of the world, existed in olden times. It still exists in the 20th century, and it's just as pronounced.
Right, right. Next question is, sectarianism, will that be an issue on East Africa? Not sure what Mahmoud Datoo means. Make sense to you, Bashir Bhai?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think it's that prevalent in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania and Kenya, I think. Part of the reason is the efforts by the Bilal Mission, and we recently had Maulana Rizvi on MARC, Mulasker Resource Center, talk about the biography that he wrote for his father, Marhum Maulana Akhtar Rizvi, and the efforts that he initiated and that people now are building upon in Tanzania, and it was extended to Kenya, to try and convert the indigenous population, in this particular case, from Sunnism to Shiism. And it has borne a lot of fruits in those two countries. So, and I think the leadership, especially in Tanzania, doesn't inflame these tensions. They have a system where we alternate. We have sometimes a Christian president, sometimes a Muslim president. Now we have a lady Muslim president in Tanzania. I don't think the leadership rotates as nicely in Kenya as it does in Tanzania. So I think it helps to minimize sectarianism in those two countries. I don't know, the moderator, Nazmul Bai, comes from Uganda, so he probably has a better feel for what happens in Uganda. The leadership, as we were told in this Mark presentation, the leadership in Uganda was reluctant to promote Bilal mission for whatever reasons. And this is why Bilal mission is not active in Uganda. So maybe sectarianism is a little more prevalent in Uganda than I think it is certainly in Tanzania, and also perhaps in Kenya, at least in the coastal region of Kenya.
Bashir, I'm from Tanzania, by the way.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
No, that's okay.
No, it's Shabir Jaffer, the moderator of Mark, who is from Uganda.
That's right.
I mixed you up.
Okay, no problem, no problem. Do you want to comment on the role history plays in sectarianism? People go back years and years and years and say, well, this is what happened then, and now it comes to surface now and inflames sectarianism. Any comments on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is what's happening in India. I think Muslims and Hindus have lived in India for a long time, harmoniously. There were some tensions at the local level, but they've lived harmoniously. They lived in the same neighborhoods. There was limited intermarriages among them. But I think now they've raised this specter of the Mughal rule, 3¼ centuries of Mughal rule. And I think it was the Secretary of State, if that's what he's called, or is it the Secretary of Internal Affairs, who publicly made the statement that they have to eliminate the subordination that the Hindus suffered under the Mughal rule for 3¼ centuries. So they are talking even of, unfortunately, they have this sense of grievance. And unfortunately, this has led to demands for revenge. So this is an old one, which kind of was simmering at a low level, didn't get really pronounced, but more recently has become pronounced because they are drawing back on history, rightly or wrongly, in my opinion, wrongly, because all the Mughals were not pro-Muslims and anti-Hindus. Akbar is one of the first Mughal emperor. He was a pluralist. He even established Din-e-Ilahi, was trying to bring 4 faith groups together: Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians. Din-e-Ilahi, he called it, and he set himself up as the deity. But unfortunately, it did not spread beyond his court, and this Din-e-Ilahi died down with his death.
Yeah, it's a shame. There's so much suffering and violence. Anyway, I don't see any more questions, but I will ask you one more if I may.
Sure.
Do you want to comment on Black Lives Matter and the racism in the States against basically blacks, the African Americans. How do you link that to sectarianism? It is sectarianism, right? Or
No,
not?
it's the ethnic. It's not sectarianism because blacks are Christians as much as whites are. So it's not so much sectarianism, it's really ethnicity, racism. It's racism that unfortunately has been inflamed in the past 4 or 5 years. It has always been there because the blacks have always felt that they are not getting a fair share of the deal. There's still injustice that they suffer from, particularly when it comes to courts of law. They see that there is discrimination in how verdicts are handed down. Normally, it favors the whites against the blacks. So unfortunately, the situation now has really been inflamed. And we don't know what will happen in 2024. But if we have one of these candidates who supports this white supremacy and inflames it or reinvigorates it, hopefully during the current presidency, it will begin to die down. It hasn't yet. But if we have a candidate, whoever it is, who chooses to appeal to the white supremacists, the extremist groups, and inflames it, then this ethnic-based sectarianism, it's not religious-based, it's ethnic-based, race-based, to be specific, will get even worse.
Yeah, but I think going back to your basic definition of sectarianism, when a large segment of the population is put aside or set aside by another large group or segment of the society, one looking down on the other, or there is basic tension, is that not sectarianism?
It is, sorry, did you finish?
No, I was just saying that is based, it may be discrimination. It may be, you can call it whatever, but it is sectarianism.
Yes, it is. Remember, I gave upfront the definition of sectarism. Correct. I said, generally, it refers to any kind of division, all kinds of divisions within a state or a region even. And it's not just religion, it could be all kinds of, but more typically, it's narrowly defined because of the word sect in sectarianism. It's narrowly defined to be differences within a religious group or differences between and among faith-based groups. But yes, you're right. Any kind of differences can be labeled sectarianism and can be inflamed.
Thank you. Final question from Razakara. Do intra-faith and interfaith dialogues bear any fruits? The dialogues themselves, do they bear any fruit?
I can only speak about Orlando because we are fairly active with interfaith groups. I think we have had a lot of success with interfaith groups. Sadly, not as much success with intrafaith. We have invited fellow brother Muslims to join us, for instance, for iftar during Ramadan. And the last time that happened, it didn't quite work out as well as we would have liked. But that may be unique to our region. Maybe Toronto has had better experience with it than we have had locally, but we have had tremendous success with interfaith groups. They use our facility, they invite us to their gatherings, we invite them to our gatherings, and we all respect each other. We don't criticize each other. We all respect their beliefs. We try to understand what their beliefs are, not in any way demonize them or criticize their beliefs.
Excellent. On that happy note, we will bring this to a close. It's 3:07. Bashir bhai, thank you so much for enlightening us on your research and your presentation. Some good points and lots of food for thought for future.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you. Next week, climate change. Mr. Makbul Rahim from London, England, will be addressing us. That certainly would be an exciting topic to listen to. Thank you all. See you next Sunday, 2 o'clock, same time. You'll get the notice tonight, inshallah. Thank you.